The train had already begun moving when the widow stepped inside. Steam drifted past the windows, and the iron wheels slowly found their rhythm against the rails. Most of the seats were already filled with travelers, farmers heading west, merchants with leather cases, families chasing new beginnings across the frontier. The young widow hesitated near the aisle. Her dress was plain and worn from travel. Dust clung to the hem, and in her arms she carried a small bundle wrapped tightly in a faded blanket. She looked exhausted. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long day's work, but the deeper kind. The kind that settles into a person after weeks of fear and sleepless nights. Her eyes moved across the train car until they found an empty seat beside a tall cowboy staring quietly out the window. He wore a weathered hat pulled low over calm eyes. His coat was dusty, his hands rough from years of ranch work. Caleb Stone had spent most of his life riding across open land where men minded their own business. So when the widow quietly asked, "May I sit here?" he simply nodded once. "Seats free." The train whistle sounded again as the countryside began rolling past the windows. Fields, hills, miles of quiet prairie stretching beneath the evening sky. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The steady rhythm of the train filled the silence. Metal on iron. A slow rocking motion that made the entire carriage feel almost peaceful. Then something unexpected happened. The widow's shoulders slowly sagged, her eyes closed, and without realizing it, she leaned gently against Caleb's shoulder. A few passengers nearby noticed immediately. One man chuckled under his breath. Another woman whispered something to her husband. Everyone expected the cowboy to wake her, to move away, to say something. But Caleb didn't move. He simply shifted his coat slightly so her head would rest more comfortably, and he remained perfectly still. The train continued through the darkening countryside. Stars began appearing outside the windows one by one, and the widow slept as if she had not rested in weeks. Caleb glanced down for the first time. The woman's face looked pale beneath the dim lantern light. Strands of dark hair rested softly against her cheek. There was something fragile about the way she slept, like someone who had carried too much sorrow for too long. Then he noticed the bundle in her arms. It moved, just slightly. Caleb's eyes narrowed. The blanket shifted again, and a tiny hand slowly slipped free from the folds of cloth. It wasn't luggage. It wasn't belongings. It was a child. A very small one, barely more than an infant. The baby slept quietly against the widow's chest, its tiny fingers curling gently in the fabric of her dress. Caleb leaned back slightly, careful not to wake either of them. He had expected many things when the stranger sat beside him, but not that. Across the aisle, another passenger had also noticed. A man in a dark coat watching them with unusual interest. His eyes lingered on the child, then slowly lifted toward the widow's sleeping face. Recognition flickered there, sharp, sudden. The man leaned slightly toward the traveler beside him and whispered something, too quiet for most of the train to hear, but Caleb heard it. A name. Not widow, not ma'am, not even miss. The man whispered a name that sounded far more important. A name spoken with the kind of caution men use when discussing money or power. Whitmore. Caleb's eyes slowly returned to the sleeping woman resting against his shoulder. The name didn't mean much to him yet, but the way the stranger had said it did, because men didn't whisper names like that unless someone was looking for them. And judging by the tension in the man's voice, someone was. Morning light slowly crept through the windows of the train. The soft gray glow of dawn spread across the prairie outside, while the iron wheels continued their steady rhythm along the tracks. For a long moment nothing changed. The widow still slept quietly against Caleb's shoulder. The child rested peacefully in her arms, and the passengers around them remained wrapped in the tired silence of early morning travel. Then the train whistle sounded, long and low. The sudden sound stirred the woman from sleep. Her head lifted quickly and she blinked in confusion. For a moment she didn't seem to remember where she was. Then her eyes widened. "Oh." She pulled back immediately, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to." Caleb gave a small shake of his head. "You looked like you needed the rest." The widow hesitated. Kindness from strangers often felt unfamiliar to someone who had spent too long alone. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her eyes then dropped quickly to the bundle in her arms. She checked the child instinctively. The baby stirred but did not wake. Relief passed across her face. Caleb studied her carefully now. Up close he could see the faint lines of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the guarded look in someone who expected trouble to follow them wherever they went. "You travelin' far?" he asked. She hesitated, just long enough for the silence to say more than words. "I'm heading west," she answered finally. "That's about all I know." Caleb nodded slowly. He had heard that answer before, usually from people trying not to tell the whole truth. Across the train car, the man in the dark coat was still watching them. His eyes flickered briefly toward the child again, then toward the widow, then toward Caleb. A quiet calculation seemed to pass across his face, as if he were measuring something. The train began slowing as it approached the next station, a small frontier town barely large enough to deserve the name. Wooden buildings, a single water tower, dust blowing lazily across the platform. The conductor moved down the aisle calling out the stop. Several passengers stood to gather their bags. The man in the dark coat rose as well. Before leaving the train car, he paused beside Caleb's seat. His eyes drifted once more toward the child in the widow's arms. Then he smiled faintly. "Traveling with family?" he asked. The question sounded harmless, but something about the way he said it carried a quiet edge. Caleb answered calmly, "Does it matter?" The stranger chuckled softly. "Not to me." He tipped his hat slightly. "But there are people who might be very interested." Then he stepped off the train, disappearing into the early morning light outside. The widow had gone pale. Her fingers tightened around the blanket wrapped around the child. "You know that man?" Caleb asked quietly. She shook her head quickly, too quickly. "No." But fear had already returned to her eyes, the kind of fear that comes when someone realizes the road behind them may not be as empty as they hoped. The train began moving again, slowly leaving the small town behind. Miles of open prairie stretched ahead, quiet, endless. But Caleb had lived long enough on the frontier to understand something important. Trouble rarely arrived loudly. Sometimes it appeared as nothing more than a man in a dark coat asking polite questions. He glanced once more at the child sleeping peacefully in the widow's arms, then back at the woman beside him. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "if someone's chasing you, you might want to tell the man sitting next to you." The widow stared out the window for several seconds, watching the town disappear behind them, watching the last chance to turn back fade into the distance. Then she whispered something so quietly only Caleb could hear. "They're not looking for me. They're looking for him." For several long seconds, Caleb said nothing. The train rolled steadily west across the open prairie, while the widow's quiet words hung between them. "They're looking for him." Caleb glanced again at the small child sleeping in her arms. The boy could not have been more than a year old. His tiny hand rested peacefully against the blanket, unaware of the danger that seemed to follow him across half the country. Caleb lowered his voice. "Who is he?" The widow's eyes moved slowly around the train car. Passengers talked quietly. A farmer across the aisle was reading a newspaper. 2 children laughed near the back of the carriage. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary morning train, but her voice dropped to a whisper. "He's my son." Caleb waited. He had the feeling that was only part of the truth. And his father? Caleb asked gently. The widow's eyes darkened slightly. Dead, she said. The word carried a weight that made Caleb believe her, but still something remained unsaid. She pulled the blanket slightly tighter around the sleeping child. My husband wasn't just a farmer, she continued quietly. He owned land. Caleb raised an eyebrow. A lot of men own land. She shook her head slowly. No, she said, not like this. The train thundered across a wooden bridge, the sudden noise filling the car before fading again into the steady rhythm of travel. When the sound passed, she spoke again. My husband owned nearly half the valley north of Red Hollow. Caleb's expression changed slightly. He knew that valley. Every rancher in 3 counties knew it. Good grass, strong water, land rich enough to make a man wealthy for generations. Then why are you running? Caleb asked. Her eyes lowered toward the sleeping child again. Because someone else wants it. And the easiest way to take a man's land, she hesitated, is to make sure his family disappears. Caleb leaned back slowly in his seat. Now the pieces were starting to fit. The frightened widow, the man watching them, the whispered name, Whitmore. That the name he used? Caleb asked quietly. Her head lifted sharply. You heard that? Caleb nodded once. She closed her eyes briefly, as if the secret she had tried to carry alone was finally too heavy to hold. My husband's name was Daniel Whitmore, she said softly. He died 2 months ago. Caleb studied her face. Accident? She shook her head. No. Murder. Outside the window, the prairie stretched endlessly beneath the rising sun. Beautiful, peaceful. But the story she was telling carried the quiet weight of something darker. The men who killed him thought the land would pass to them, she continued, but they were wrong. Her eyes moved slowly to the child sleeping against her chest. It passed to him. Caleb exhaled quietly. The realization settled heavily in his mind. The baby wasn't just a child. He was an heir, which meant anyone who wanted the Whitmore land had a very simple problem to solve. Remove the heir. Caleb glanced toward the rear of the train car. The man in the dark coat was gone now, but something told him that didn't mean they were safe. Does anyone else know you're on this train? Caleb asked. The widow shook her head. I bought the ticket under another name. She hesitated. Anna. But my real name, she swallowed quietly, is Eliza Whitmore. Caleb looked out the window at the endless prairie sliding past. The world suddenly felt much larger and much more dangerous, because somewhere out there, a man had already recognized that name. The train whistle sounded again sometime near midday, long and sharp, the kind of sound that carried for miles across open land. Caleb glanced out the window. The prairie had begun to change. The wide, empty grasslands slowly gave way to scattered fences and distant ranch houses. They were getting close to Red Hollow. Passengers around them began gathering their bags. A merchant closed his case. A farmer lifted a crate from beneath his seat. The quiet movement of travelers preparing to leave filled the train car. But Eliza had gone very still. Her eyes were fixed on the platform slowly coming into view ahead. 3 horses stood waiting near the station, and beside them, 3 men. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the way they stood. Not like travelers, not like townsfolk waiting for family. Still, patient, watching the train approach. Eliza's fingers tightened around the child. They're early, she whispered. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. You know them? She shook her head, but fear had already crept back into her voice. They work for him. The train began slowing, iron wheels grinding gently against the rails. Steam drifted past the windows. Caleb studied the platform carefully now. The three men had not moved. Their eyes followed the train as it rolled closer. Waiting. "Looks like our friend in the dark coat sent word ahead," Caleb said quietly. Eliza's voice barely rose above a whisper. "What do we do?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He watched the platform, the station building, the narrow street leading away from the tracks. Years of riding the frontier had taught him one useful habit: always study the ground before stepping onto it. The train shuddered as it slowed further. Soon it would stop, and when it did, those men would be waiting. Caleb finally stood. "Stay close to me," he said calmly. The train came to a stop. Passengers began stepping down onto the wooden platform one by one, boots hitting planks, voices rising in casual conversation. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary afternoon arrival. Caleb stepped down from the train first. Then he reached up and helped Eliza carefully onto the platform, making sure the child remained hidden beneath the blanket. The moment her boots touched the wood, the three men began walking toward them, slow, confident. The leader was tall, with a dark mustache and a coat too fine for a simple ranch hand. His eyes moved immediately to the child in Eliza's arms, then to her face. "Well now," he said with a faint smile, "Mrs. Whitmore." The name hung in the warm afternoon air. Several nearby passengers turned their heads slightly, but none of them understood the danger behind the sound of it. Caleb stepped forward just enough to place himself between the men and Eliza. The stranger's smile widened slightly. "And who might you be?" he asked. Caleb's voice remained calm. "Just someone standing in your way." The man studied him carefully. Then he laughed softly. "Friend," he said, "this doesn't concern you." His gaze shifted back toward Eliza. "We're here to escort Mrs. Whitmore and the boy back home." Eliza's voice trembled slightly behind Caleb. "We're not going anywhere with you." The man's smile faded. That wasn't a request. Caleb's eyes moved slowly across the three men, their boots, their coats, the quiet bulges beneath their jackets where guns rested. He had seen men like this before, men who believed the law belonged to whoever held the most land. Caleb removed his hat slowly, not in surrender, but in preparation. Then he spoke quietly. "Looks like you boys picked the wrong train." For a moment the entire platform fell quiet. Wind moved slowly across the dusty street of Red Hollow, while the three men studied the cowboy standing in front of them. Caleb did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, still, solid, the kind of stillness that made other men think carefully before taking another step. The leader tilted his head slightly. "You don't understand the situation," he said calmly. "That child belongs to the Whitmore estate." Eliza's voice came quietly from behind Caleb. "He belongs to me." The man chuckled softly. "That's not how inheritance works, Mrs. Whitmore." Several townspeople had begun to notice the tension now. A blacksmith stepped out from his shop across the street. Two ranch hands paused near the hitching posts. Small frontier towns had a way of sensing trouble before it fully arrived. The man in the fine coat took another step forward. "You see," he continued, "Mr. Whitmore's property now falls under the management of my employer, and we're here to collect what belongs to him." Caleb finally spoke again, his voice quiet, but steady. "That boy's the heir." The man's eyes hardened slightly. "That's exactly the problem." His hand drifted slowly toward the revolver at his hip. The other two men shifted their weight as well, boots scraping softly across the wooden boards. Caleb noticed the movement. So did the townspeople, and suddenly the air in Red Hollow felt much tighter. Then another voice cut through the silence. "Now hold on a minute," The sheriff of Red Hollow stepped out from the station office, an older man with silver hair and a long coat. He rested one hand casually near the star pinned to his chest. "What seems to be the trouble here?" he asked. The stranger's smile returned, but thinner now. "Just a family matter." He gestured toward Eliza. "We're escorting Mrs. Whitmore and the child back to their proper home." The sheriff looked carefully from the men, to Caleb, to the frightened widow holding the baby. "Eliza Whitmore," the sheriff said slowly. "That your name?" She nodded. "Yes." "And this your boy?" "Yes." The sheriff studied the strangers again. Then he spoke calmly. "Well then, seems to me the boy stays with his mother." The man's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff." The sheriff shrugged slightly. "Maybe. But around here we don't take babies from their mothers at gunpoint." Behind him, 2 more townsmen had quietly stepped closer. Then another, and another. Red Hollow might have been small, but frontier towns had a habit of standing together when outsiders caused trouble. The stranger glanced around at the growing crowd, at the rifles resting casually against doorframes, at the silent message written across the faces of the townspeople. Finally, he gave a small, irritated laugh. "This isn't finished," he said. He tipped his hat slightly toward Eliza. "We'll be seeing each other again." Then he turned and walked back toward his horse. The other 2 men followed. Moments later, the sound of hooves faded down the dusty road. Silence slowly returned to the street. The tension drained from the air like a storm finally passing. The sheriff turned toward Caleb. "You planning on explaining any of that?" Caleb glanced briefly at Eliza and the child. "Long story," he said. The sheriff nodded once. "Well, looks like you've got time." Eliza looked down at the baby in her arms. For the first time since boarding the train, her hands were no longer trembling. Caleb adjusted his hat and looked out across the quiet town, then back toward her. "You still looking for a place to start over?" he asked. Eliza met his eyes. A small, tired smile slowly appeared. "Yes." Caleb nodded toward the road leading out of town. "There's a ranch a mile west of here. Good land. Quiet place to raise a boy." Eliza remembered the moment from the night before, the gentle rhythm of the train, the stranger who had allowed her to sleep safely on his shoulder. Sometimes life changed not with grand gestures, but with simple acts of kindness. She stepped beside him as they began walking down the dusty road together, the child sleeping peacefully between them. And for the first time since the long journey began, Eliza Whitmore finally felt something she had not known in months: hope.